Johnson Williams wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention. He kept his head down, his words few, and his thoughts to himself. Most days, he moved through the crowded halls of Westbridge High like a shadow present, but rarely acknowledged. He wasn't loud or reckless. If anything, he was cautious, almost too careful. And maybe that's what made Principal Veronica Stevens notice him, not in a good way. One afternoon, after an alleged dress code violations, his hoodie was a little too long. Apparently, she called him out in front of the entire cafeteria. The room went quiet as she told him to dress like he respects himself, her voice sharp and eyes cold. Johnson didn't say a word. He just stood there, burning with quiet humiliation as whispers rippled through the room. It wasn't the first time he'd felt that sting, like he was being measured by something no one would admit aloud. Race wasn't spoken about at Westbridge, but Johnson knew it lived in the spaces between words, in the looks, in the way some rules seemed to bend for others but break for him. The next morning, Johnson was called into the main office again. This time, Principal Stevens didn't raise her voice. She smiled, which somehow felt worse. "Since you enjoy standing out so much," she said, sliding a folded paper across the desk, "you'll be performing at the spring concert. A violin solo." Johnson blinked. "I don't play violin." "You'll figure it out," she replied curtly, already moving on to the next item on her desk. It wasn't a suggestion. It was punishment disguised as opportunity. As he walked out, Johnson could already hear the laughter in the hallways. Word spread fast, especially when it gave people something to mock. A violin solo from the quiet black kid with no music background? It was comedy to them. Johnson kept his face blank, but inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't about discipline, it was about control, about making sure he knew his place. Still, he didn't push back. He never had. But later that day, sitting alone in the back of the library, a voice broke through the noise in his head. "Maybe you should play," Aisha said gently, sliding into the seat across from him. She looked him in the eye. "And maybe you should make them regret giving you the mic." Johnson didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't immediately dismiss the thought either. That night, Johnson couldn't sleep. Aisha's words played over and over in his mind like a looping track, sharp, honest, and just soft enough to stay with him. He kept imagining the stage, the lights, the smirks in the audience. But more than that, he imagined what it would feel like to stand there and not just take the hit but own the moment. The next day after school, instead of heading straight home, he wandered into the music wing. It was quiet, most students were already gone. He paused outside the door of the orchestra room, heart pounding, then pushed it open. Mr. Carter, the school's music teacher, looked up from a filing cabinet. "Can I help you, Johnson?" Johnson hesitated. "I need to learn the violin." Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow, curious but not unkind. "For the spring concert?" Johnson nodded. There was a long pause. Then, Mr. Carter walked to the back of the room, unlocked a cabinet, and pulled out a well-worn violin case. "It won't be easy," he said, handing it to him. "But if you're serious, I'll meet you here every day after school." Johnson took the case, his palms sweating. It felt heavier than he expected. He didn't know where this would lead, but something about holding that instrument made him feel like, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't powerless. The first few sessions were rough. Johnson's hands cramped. His bow screeched across the strings in ways that made him wince. But Mr. Carter didn't flinch. He was patient. Too patient, really. "It's not about being perfect," he said once, after Johnson had tossed the bow onto the chair in frustration. "It's about showing up again tomorrow." So Johnson did. Day after day, he stayed after school, long after the hallways emptied. At home, he practiced with a rubber mute to keep from waking his grandmother, who worked nights. He watched old videos online, trying to understand the way the grates move smooth, fluid, effortless. But it was one rainy afternoon, about 3 weeks in, that something shifted. Mr. Carter had stepped out to take a phone call, and Johnson was left alone in the room. He closed his eyes, drew the bow across the strings, and let his fingers move this time, without overthinking. The sound that came out wasn't perfect, but it was warm, full, real. He didn't know where it came from, but it felt familiar, like something inside him that had just been waiting to wake up. When Mr. Carter returned, he didn't say anything right away. He just listened. Then finally, he spoke, softer this time. "Do you know who your father was?" Johnson looked up, startled. "I mean, really was?" Mr. Carter opened a drawer and pulled out an old newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. The headline read, "Local violin prodigy woes state judges James Williams, age 17. Johnson's hands trembled as he held the paper. His father, a name he barely knew now, ringing in his ears. Johnson stared at the photo in the clipping. His father was young, confident, standing with a violin tucked beneath his chin, eyes focused like the whole world disappeared when he played. It was the same quiet fire Johnson had started to feel each time he held the instrument. "I didn't know," he whispered. Mr. Carter nodded. "Not many did. Your dad was the real deal. But life, it got in the way. He never got the chance he deserved." Johnson felt something heavy and electric settle in his chest, grief, pride, and something else, purpose. For the first time, the concert wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about carrying forward something that was nearly lost. Over the next few weeks, Johnson trained like it was all he had. Mr. Carter pushed him harder, and Aisha kept showing up sitting in the corner of the room after school, cheering him on, offering water bottles and quiet encouragement. The notes that once felt foreign began to settle under his skin. His fingers moved with more confidence, and the sound of his violin filled the music room with something honest and alive. Still, the whispers around school didn't stop. Some students laughed when they heard he was still performing. Principal Stevens even dropped a sarcastic comment in the hallway. "Hope you've been practicing, Maestro." Johnson didn't flinch this time. He just smiled. "You'll see," he said. Because deep down, he already knew this wouldn't end the way she thought it would. The night of the spring concert arrived faster than Johnson expected. The auditorium buzzed with energy, parents chatting, students fidgeting in stiff clothes, teachers finding their seats. Johnson waited backstage, violin in hand, palms damp despite all the hours of practice. His name was last on the program, tucked quietly between two ensemble pieces as if no one expected much. As the performances went on, he barely heard the music. All he could hear was his heart pounding. When his name was finally called, a few kids in the crowd chuckled. Principal Stevens smirked from her front row seat, arms folded. But Johnson walked to the center of the stage without hesitation. He placed the violin on his shoulder, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. The first note rang out soft but clear, like the opening line of a story he'd been waiting years to tell. Then, the next. And the next, the room grew still. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, something he'd composed himself, he opened his eyes. People weren't whispering or laughing. They were watching, really watching. By the time the final note echoed through the air, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer, then erupted. Applause. Real, stunned, rising from their seats kind of applause. Even Principal Stevens looked frozen. And that moment, those seconds on stage, were no longer about revenge or proving a point. It was something deeper, something that belonged to him, and to his father, and to every time he'd been told to stay small. After the concert, Johnson barely made it backstage before Aisha tackled him in a hug. "You did it," she whispered, voice thick. "You really did it, Mr." Carter stood nearby, clapping slowly with a proud smile that said more than words ever could. But the real shift came the next morning. Word had traveled fast. Students who never spoke to Johnson before were nodding at him in the hallway. Teachers who once looked past him now looked twice. Even the office secretary offered him a warm good morning with a sincerity he hadn't heard in years. Later that week, an emergency school board meeting was held. Parents had questions. Why had Johnson been forced to perform as punishment? Why had Miss Reynolds consistently targeted students of color in subtle, yet measurable ways? The board didn't have many answers, but they did take action. Principal Stevens and Miss Reynolds were placed on leave pending investigation. For Johnson, it wasn't about revenge, it was about being seen. The recognition felt overdue, but it was honest. A few days later, Mr. Carter handed him an envelope. "Open it," he said. Inside was a letter from the Eastman School of Music, a full scholarship. Johnson's hands trembled, just like they had when he first held that violin. Only this time, it wasn't fear, it was possibility, the kind his father never got. And as he stepped outside into the late spring sun, violin case over his shoulder, Johnson smiled because the future finally felt like his.